At a time of profound change for women, at a time of pressing urgency around the world, at a time of extraordinary challenges for women, but a time of extraordinary possibilities for women, Harvard Law convenes some of the world's greatest leaders, and they're all women of Harvard Law. Against the backdrop of a changing global order, we are honored to host this high-level panel. Every single panelist, every single one of you is a glass ceiling breaker and a first. Madam President, Mary Robinson was the first woman head of state of Ireland. Navi Pillay, the first black woman on the High Court of South Africa, the first woman to head the ICTR, Susan Page, the first ambassador to South Sudan, the first US ambassador to South Sudan, the world's youngest country, Marissa Wellesley, the first woman senior partner to retire and found a women's initiative, Irene Khan, the first woman to head Amnesty International, and the first woman to head the largest intergovernmental organization on the rule of law, the IDLO, the International Development Law Organization. And you all incredibly happen to be women of Harvard Law. What a pride. So what a parade of firsts, but none of you stopped at being the firsts. I think that is what defines all of you. Each of you made gender and women central to your historic agenda. And that is what distinguishes you, and that has been your common cause. And the overarching theme that really binds you all is that all of you bear witness to some of the greatest challenges of our time, and you raise your voice to address those challenges. So at a time of challenge here in the US, when the United States is leaving the Human Rights Council, we are hosting 2 high commissioners for human rights. What an honor, what a pride, what a richness that we've brought together. So what I'm going to do this morning is to ask each one of you to speak on some of those political challenges, but also to share with us one personal narrative, because after all, the personal is political, and storytelling is central to feminist methodology. So Navi, I'm going to start with you. You have said, I'm always conscious that I would be failing in my duty if I were to relax and fail to use the power of my voice and the power of my office to keep the spotlight on advancing protections every minute of every day. Navi, you were the first woman to start a law practice in Natal during the apartheid regime, when you defended apartheid activists and challenged the regime. You served as the judge on 2 of the most important international criminal courts, as the president of the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and then on the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to try war crimes, crimes against human rights, and genocide. And you were the 5th UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. At this moment in time, with the rise of the Me Too movement, we need to recognize our heroes. You gave the ruling in the groundbreaking judgment in the Akeyesu case, where you ruled against Taba Mayor John Paul Akeyesu, who was tried for inciting Hutus to rape, torture, and murder thousands of Tutsis. And you said in that case, we want to send out a strong signal that rape is no longer a trophy of war. Akeyesu has been heralded as the most important decision rendered thus far in the history of women's jurisprudence. So what I want you to do is to speak to us about the story of Akeyesu and the ways in which you were influenced by the women advocates who came up with the theory that genocide and rape and sexual crimes are crimes against humanity and war crimes, and you listen to them.
You want me to add after that long introduction? I mean, I think she said it all. Let me also say that these are challenging times. I've been particularly to many universities, but also public conferences in different countries where they want to hear the voice of human rights because people feel so threatened that you have statements coming from this country at the highest level that are being picked up now. Even inside the UN, I'm hearing that very many states who are not respectful of human rights are finding it the excuse now to take a reactionary position. So these are very challenging times. Thank you for holding this panel. So the decision on Akayasu, let me also add to you that of the panels in both the tribunals where there was a decision, a conviction of rape and sexual violence of women and children, invariably that happened because there was a woman on the bench. So where you had 3 men on the bench, they took the position that, all right, so they were raped, but they were killed, so let's just deal with the killing. So my understanding came not only because of my experience in South Africa, and I came from NGOs. Let me tell you, that is very rare in the United Nations for someone from the NGO to be appointed, because invariably those holding power there come from government. Susan is now in the UN, I heard, but a different Susan, I think. So I think my own experience came with me, but I didn't realize the importance of the Akayasu decision myself, because judges make a decision on the facts and the evidence before them. We don't think, I'm going to make a groundbreaking impact here. No, this is when UNIFEM's head, Nolene Heiser, appointed me for an award in Hollywood, of all things. I had a glamorous escort. I forget his name, but it's... But
he was glam.
Hey?
He was glamorous.
Oh, glamorous. He gave me his cell phone number to call him as well, yeah. It was... So there she introduced me as saying, for years and years, women were struggling to recognize rape and sexual violence in wars and conflicts as war crimes, and they had never succeeded. And now it happened. So why did it happen? It's because women were brave enough to come and give the testimony before us. And as I listened to the evidence of one woman, I think she was witness H, she had been gang raped, and the prosecutor was very, very anxious. And first he said, we don't want to hear you about the rape and so on, because we didn't ask you about it. And I said, we want to hear her, because that's what we're here for, a court of justice. We want to hear that. It is true, I would have hesitated doing that in a national court. We're still very tied up with rules, but this is a court set up by the UN, which is a norm-based organization to deal with genocide. So I felt free enough to say to her, we want to hear this witness. And the other 2 judges on my panel also supported us and me and asked her questions. And so the prosecutor was asking her, yes, but, did the penis enter your vagina? And she said, it was not only that, it was much worse. The things, they were youngsters, they didn't respect me as a mother, and the things they said as they were raping me still hurts. And so that alerted me to look at the experience of women when you're defining rape. There was no commonly accepted definition of rape and sexual violence in international law. There wasn't. There's national definitions. I think your country and South Africa at the time had the penetration, and that's why it's only what happens to women that constitutes rape. So therefore, I'm really pleased Jessica Neuwirth is here. She helped me write that judgment. And she consulted others. I always say to academics how important it is that you write. Because when we're sitting here in judgment, we need these concepts to be spelled out. And so that's how we came up with the new definition of rape, which is gender neutral, and it's not a body part definition. It's been adopted in 2 states here in the United States. It's been adopted by South Africa. The Constitutional Court ordered the South African government to change the definition because the Constitutional Court had a case where a 4-year-old boy had been sodomized, and the sentence for that is very low. If it had been a girl child, it would be very high. And he thought there's something wrong with that because the suffering of the victim is the same. So up it went to the appeals court and then the Constitutional Court. It referred to the Akayesu decision, ordered the government to come up with a definition that is gender neutral. So, you know, I can talk on and on about it, but you asked for a story now. I am asked to speak because, it's in me, in my genes, to always be positive, look for strategies, because we learned this when we struggled against apartheid. We fought our own struggles, but we couldn't do that without the collective help of the international community. And we're very grateful for that 300 years of apartheid came to an end. I never thought it will end in my lifetime. And so that's one of the contributory factors on why I remain positive. So yesterday around this time, I was speaking at Wisconsin-Madison, and they asked me to address the challenges of UDHR just because of statements coming from powerful people, including a professor from Harvard who said that it's the end of human rights. So I see it as my responsibility to give the positive examples on how civil society is working on these issues. They're not giving up. Civil society, the advancement of human rights and international justice can be traced to 400 years ago, even 2,000 years ago with the Greeks, Grotius, and so on. We don't want to be the generation of 2018 that lost it all. So we've got to keep going, not only for that reason, but for young people. So here's a story. Since I have the former ambassador of South Sudan here, let me say I went as High Commissioner to South Sudan, and 2 interns, they were not even staff, they were young interns, asked me to come to Juba in the Blue Nile area, which is only accessible by the UN helicopter. So we went over. And there in the mud and under the trees, these 2 interns had gathered about 10 women. They came from different tribes. They had different branding on them, like cattle. Some had huge marks. Some had the forefront teeth removed to indicate which tribe they belonged to. So and they didn't speak the same language. We had 3 sets of interpreters. And 2 mothers said that their 12-year-old girls had been killed by the husband, because the husband had arranged a forcible marriage between the young girls and the 65-year-old tribesman who owned cattle. So it was an exchange of women for cattle. The girls refused. The fathers killed those girls. And the mothers said, we know where they are buried, in the backyard, but no one is paying any attention to this. Do we have any rights? We gave birth to these children. Do we have any rights? So I explained what you and I take for granted, about human rights. But I thought this is really a hopeless situation. This is like another planet. And off I went. But a few weeks later, the South Sudanese ambassador in Geneva came to see me. And he said something has happened that has never happened before. These women gathered together and they went to see the governor of that state and said, we want our human rights. And so these are what motivates me.
And I think your visit itself sent a strong message and was a motivational factor. But I want to take a moment to tell you what inspires me most about your moving life, Navi, is when you have told us that during the apartheid regime, when you were one of the few black women in the University of Natal, you had to wait from morning till night for your classes, because while the white students went to law firms to do apprentice programs. You, as a black woman, was not allowed inside those portals of the white law firms. So therefore, you had to stay in the law school from morning till 10 in the night. And in between, you went to the library and you read up, you soaked up all of the literature on the Nuremberg trials, because that was all you could do. But that then helped to influence the trajectory of your life, the destiny of your career. And that really was an influential moment. So you've always mined the challenges to your advantage in ways that have really informed you, but most of all, made positive change in the world. So thank you. So next I turn to Ambassador Page, because I think it's a great way to connect what you said, the stories that you shared of South Sudan. So Ambassador Page's role, as you know, was as our first representative in South Sudan. So your role was really to help to build a new nation, a nation that did not exist in time or space. You also had to resolve continuing conflict and be a broker of peace. So can you tell us how you met with those challenges in a country that was yet to exist in our imagination, and a country that still is steeped in conflict? Just in August, South Sudan signed its peace treaty, but at least 20,000 children have been dubbed the lost boys of South Sudan. And South Sudan still remains a lost country. And you've always said, South Sudan, never let go of your dreams. So can you speak to us about that?
Thank you very much. And as Navi said, thank you very much for organizing this panel. I don't know how I managed to get onto this panel with such esteemed people, but this is amazing for me. And thank you, all of you, for attending. You know, South Sudan was important for me, Southern Sudan at the start, because I had the great fortune of being involved in the peace process itself for trying to end Africa's longest running civil war. And that was a long process. It was difficult. It was not as long as many peace agreement processes are, because there had been many attempts before. But this was a sort of revitalized peace process, and it was under IGAD, a regional grouping of the Horn of Africa states, but it was led by Kenya. And the chief mediator was a general. And the background that he had as a military man was really key to understanding the underlying conflicts in Sudan, which of course included Southern Sudan. But we succeeded eventually. I mean, there were many times when we would see suitcases being packed and going out the door. They didn't bother to tell us in the secretariat, the mediation team, we're fed up, we're leaving, this side did that, or that side did something. So there were many starts and stops, and unexpected brief vacations where I was able to actually go back to Nairobi and be with my son, or live a little bit of a life, except that you're still hanging. You don't know, are we going to be able to get the talks restarted? Is this going to be the death knell? And it was an opportunity because it was shortly after 9/11. And so at that point, there was a window of opportunity for the Sudanese to try to get back on the right track. There's a saying that the Sudanese and South Sudanese say, which is that once you've drunk from the Nile, Sudan never leaves you. And that's the thing. I drank from the Nile. I mean, it's a literal and a figurative sense, but I mean, the water does come from the Nile. So it's true that even now, it hasn't left me. The challenges were many, because once South Sudan gained its independence from Sudan in 2011, as you said, there was no actual country. There were still zones of the country that the army of Sudan hadn't yet completely left, and they had to put in place their own administration. Not a lot of people had that kind of education, but the hopes were so high. unrealistically high, but nonetheless really high. They were starting off with a blank check. I mean, they were not carrying over debt from Sudan. They were not carrying over anything except literally like a blank slate. And there was so much support from the world that here's a country that has claimed its self-determination and could go forward. But within only a few months, civil war broke out inside South Sudan. And I'd say for me, the biggest challenges were trying to convince Washington and the State Department that the embassy should stay open because people were fleeing. Nuer were being targeted because the government belief was that Riek Machar, the former vice president, was trying to overthrow the government, starting a coup. We had no evidence of the same, and so we didn't believe that. But that then turned into, the U.S. is for regime change. So we had to wade through all of these types of issues. I was able to convince the State Department we needed to stay open, and obviously it wasn't just me. There were lots of other people who believed the same. But as we started getting lining up our evacuation planes to come in, the president had closed the airport because he was worried that something worse could happen because now they were truly marching towards war. And I went in, the first thing I did was I went into the president and I said, Mr. President, I know this is a horrible time for your people, but we also, who have been one of your biggest supporters in the United States, we need to evacuate our people and reinforce security at the embassy so that our lives are protected and get out unnecessary staff who don't need to be here. He finally agreed to open the airport, and I was able to board, I don't know how many, 20 some odd planes and say goodbye to a number of people. So in terms of the story, I would say the conversations continued, trying to get them to change, trying to get them to put their country back together, actually have the identity of all of the different ethnic groups, the different tribes, but at the same time, recognize that diversity as a positive thing. And so even against the backdrop of people who themselves had been so poorly treated, turned around and treated their own people in ways that many people said to me, even the Arabs didn't treat us this way. They have a much worse term for that, but I will spare you that term. And that's just shattering to hear that even when we were occupied, even when we didn't have our rights, even the Arabs didn't treat us like non-people. So that was really painful. And then I think the worst part for me was as we started recognizing that it looked like it was not going to go away soon, quickly, that the war was not going to end quickly, I went in and visited lots and lots of different IDP camps, and it sent a huge message to the people that were in those displaced camps that an ambassador would go in when their own government would not go and see them and recognize their suffering. And maybe just as the last point, when I was putting the final evacuation plane that was leaving Juba at the end of January of 2014, so the war broke out in mid-December of December 2013. So the last plane was somewhere towards the 20th of January. And I had ambassadors from other countries were getting on the planes. I managed with my team to also get a number of people who would have certainly been killed because of their ethnicity. We got them on our planes. I mean, I made incredible arguments. Oh, yes, I'm still a notary. I can sign from when I was a consular officer. I can sign on their behalf. I mean, you do what you have to do. And they're like, no, but the courts are open. The courts are not open for them to go and, here is a woman who is in the SPLA. She wants to go and serve her country. She's been called to go to this place. Here's her husband. Husband's a green card holder, U.S. passport holder, actually, U.S. citizen. and their son, who doesn't have the passport, but he's entitled to it because he is the child of an American citizen. And they were trying to say, well, no, she is not, we can't verify that she's the mother and he's the father. I'm like, the father is here saying that he's the child's father. The mother is here saying he's the child's father. And the child bears the father's exact same name. So please let me sign that, because then the woman can go off and do her duty as an SPLA nurse. And so, she's fulfilling her tasks, and she's also ensuring that her son is taken care of by the father. So you do what you need to do, and you make up creative, responses to most bizarre situations. But then the last person that I put on that plane was one of these lost boys from the 1980s war. And he had come back after the peace agreement was signed in 2005. He'd gone to still southern Sudan at the time because independence hadn't yet kicked in. I'm sorry that I have such a bad cold, but he came to help build what later would turn out to be a new country, but at least get the founding blocks right. Young, he had studied, he was a lost boy, he had studied in the United States, and he really believed. And when I put him on that last plane, that was not meant to be choked up sentence, but it was the hardest thing for me to do, to put an American South Sudanese on a plane back to the United States, when, yes, he had the right to do that, but all he wanted was to fulfill the dreams of a new nation.
And that's when you reminded South Sudan, never let go of your dreams, because that's what keeps the human race going forward, our dreams, even when hope is lost. So on that note, I'm going to turn to Irene Khan, because I want to bring the conversation back to how conflict and post-conflict has a disproportionate impact on women. Michelle Bachelet, the current High Commissioner for Human Rights, often says the rule of law rules women out. Because when we look at legal systems around the world, we see that law itself, and as lawyers, this is shameful to us, that the law is complicit in gender discrimination. For example, Algeria says very clearly that a wife, a woman who is married, must be obedient to her husband. This is in the law. But not just to the husband, but to her in-laws, to her parents-in-law, as well as to the relatives of the husband. And in many countries, a woman needs the husband's permission to open a bank account. A woman needs the husband's permission in order to access credit, in order to start a business. So in so many ways, the law legitimizes gender discrimination. So Irene, when you speak of the rule of law, and your role is really as the primary custodian of the rule of law around the world, and you have spent an enormous amount of time and attention on gender equality as cardinal to the rule of law. But you've also been very nuanced about it. Just recently, I think a month ago, you said gender equality is a multidimensional issue. And I think that's very important to Celebration 65's own theme of intersectionality. Last night, we had a very rich and vibrant conversation about the intersectionality of race and gender. But you've gone even beyond that, and you've said that intersectionality includes an interplay of class, education, rural versus urban context, political and social status, and all of these impact gender equality. So can you give us an example of your work in Afghanistan and how that multidimensional nature impacts the rule of law?
Thank you, Rangita. Before I get to Afghanistan, let me first say that what a privilege it is to have this opportunity to speak to all of you today, and what a particular privilege it is to do so on a panel with two of my heroes, Mary Robinson and Navi Pillay. So if there are any of you here who would like to use your life to make a difference, find two women who inspire you, hitch your vision or your star to their vision, and you won't go wrong. Now, in your introductory comments, Rangita, you talked about how the rule of law rules out women very often. But to my surprise, when I became head of Amnesty International, I found that the human rights movement was also ruling women out. And it was during my time at Amnesty that we launched the campaign to stop violence against women. And we spent most of our time arguing inside the movement with activists as to why violence against women, sexual and gender-based violence, family violence, domestic violence, were human rights issues, not social problems. So the human rights movement itself has tended to be gender blind, as we know from the time that the UDHR itself was drafted. So it's important to keep that in mind. Now, you asked for a story about Afghanistan. Now, in Afghanistan, my current organization, the International Development Law Organization, has been working there for many years. And one of the programs in which we take great pride is our program to train prosecutors and judges on sexual and gender-based violence, to incorporate that into their practice. Afghanistan does not have a law to combat violence against women, primarily because the feeling of the women's movements in Afghanistan, as well as of the government, is that if you take it to the legislature, if you take it to parliament, rather than adopting a law, they will actually adopt something more aggressive. So violence against women in Afghanistan is dealt through a presidential decree, through policy, rather than through law. Now, under this policy, we have been training judges, lawyers, prosecutors, defenders on gender-based violence. We have been supporting women's groups to set up women's shelter, and we have been setting up a legal network to provide legal aid to women. It's a great program. And I was very touched when a few years ago, I think it was in 2012, the New York Times ran a front-page story about a young woman. Her name was Lal Bibi. She was 18 years old. Her cousin had done something wrong, I think had offended the local police. And as retaliation, the chief of police had abducted this young woman, and she was then raped, attacked, abused for 5 days. And that is not an uncommon story, as you know, in Afghanistan. But what was uncommon was that when that woman was released, her family stood by her. They brought her to Kabul to one of the women's shelters. And there in the women's shelters, Lal Bibi met a women's rights activist called Mariam Akrami. And Mariam was the first woman in Afghanistan to set up a women's shelter. And Mariam then helped her put in a complaint with the prosecutors. Her case went through the prosecution system with support from the prosecutors we had trained. And she managed to get a judgment against these men. The police chief was convicted, and he was put in prison. And that became, for IDLO, that became an iconic case. And we went around using that case, that anecdote, to say what a great thing we had done. A couple of years ago, I pulled out that case file, and I asked my colleagues, what happened to Lal Bibi? Can we find out? And we found out that Lal Bibi and her family, after this case, did not return to their village. They stayed in Kabul for a number of years under the shelter of Mariam Akrami until her grandfather passed away. And then the family returned to the village. And immediately, Lal Bibi's father was arrested. A false case was brought against him, and he's in prison. Lal Bibi ran away with her family again from the village, and now she is somewhere in hiding in Kabul. Now, I tell you that story to make the point that justice for women means something quite different from simply putting the perpetrator in prison. And Lal Bibi's case, I think, symbolizes very strongly the systemic discrimination that women face. And unless you change those underlying prejudices and the underlying assumptions that are made by unfair laws, and you cannot ensure fair outcomes for women. And therefore, we need to look at rule of law through gender lens, and we will find quite a different story there. And Lal Bibi was in a worse situation than women like Mariam Akrami because she was poor, illiterate, lived in a remote area, did not have all those various instruments that empower women like you and me. And that, I hope, explains to you the kind of challenges that we face in many places. But I don't want to finish with a story that is quite awakening, but it's also quite depressing. I want to tell you about another Afghan woman. This young woman is called Zainab. She is actually part of our program. She is a woman prosecutor in a district called Kandahar. Now, those who know Afghanistan know that Kandahar is one of the most conservative, one of the most difficult, conflict-ridden districts. And she, this young woman in that particular district, has been working to prosecute cases of gender-based violence. And last year, she resolved 50 cases of gender-based violence. Now, that's just a drop in an ocean, or not even a drop. But when you think of this one young woman, she has young children, she has a very supportive husband who's going through this legal system, prosecuting cases successfully. So on the one side, you have the challenges, but on the other side, you also have these stories of women who are making a change. And I believe that we are at a tipping point where we actually see, with women in positions of power, with a strong, aware movements, I would rather say, of women around the world, of campaigns like #MeToo or He for She or many other campaigns around the world. There is a difference that is being made. And that's what's really inspiring and should keep us all going.
Thank you, Irene, for bearing witness and acting as the storyteller. All of you are the world's storytellers, and you bring these stories to light. You bring these stories to the open so that the world and the governments can be held accountable to these issues. So on that note, I'm going to turn to Marissa. Marissa, you recently wrote a letter to the New York Times. And this is a very provocative letter. It was titled, "You Can't Empower Us," as in women, "with chickens." And it was a very powerful idea that, opening economic opportunities alone would not be enough. Giving women chickens would not be enough. That there are other issues, the underlying issues that you spoke of, Irene, that are so important. And in terms of ways in which 104 economies still have laws that prevent women from working in specific jobs, women do not have equal rights to land, equal rights to inheritance, equal rights to property. Women do not have equal rights to guardianship or custody. Women do not have equal rights in marriage or in divorce. And this confluence of factors, this inequality in policy and in laws, impact women's economic participation and women's economic power. And as we mourn the death of the former Secretary General Kofi Annan, who appointed Madame President as the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we also remember his legacy. And as an important part of his legacy was that he saw that businesses play an important role in human rights, which at that time was a revolutionary idea, that businesses had anything to do with human rights. And he appointed John Ruggie of Harvard to create these guiding principles on business and human rights, which also then led to other areas of focus, such as the, such as the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals. So Marissa, can you speak to us about your work in making that connection, a connection between not just businesses and human rights, but business and women's rights?
Yes, thank you, Rangita, for including me on this panel. I too feel like I'm not quite sure how I could possibly be included in such an incredibly distinguished group, but I've long learned that you really shouldn't even try saying no to Rangita when she asks you to do anything, so I just said yes. I am somebody who has a sort of a different story here because I come out of many years as a corporate lawyer, although my passions have always been around women's rights and gender equity globally, inspired by a Brazilian activist, feminist mother and aunt, sociologist, and a father who was a founder of Care International and took me to Africa at the age of 16, where my life was sort of transformed in terms of my view of the world and the power of women and men at the grassroots level who can really create incredibly powerful change. And somehow I managed to be a corporate lawyer for many years, but that that positioning made me realize, as I started to see companies increasingly talk about, quote, investing in women and girls, the incredible, I felt very driven to ensure that that money was actually directed in ways and spent in ways that actually engaged the women on the ground who I viewed as the real gender experts in creating change. And I saw increasingly companies seeing a lot of good business reasons to engage more women at all levels, whether it's to drive innovations or keep their cocoa supply chain in the Ivory Coast more sustainable, or to have, drive increased productivity and engage more with their millennial employee and customer bases. There were lots of reasons driving this from a business point of view. And increasingly what I saw, though, is that the work they were doing was very light touch, in the sense that they did what you would expect businesses to do, the things they felt comfortable with, mentoring, skills training, all of these things, but not really appreciating, as all of these panelists have talked about, that any kind of true ability to engage in the economy or in political life or in anything for women requires addressing a whole host of issues, whether it's issues of gender-based violence, issues of access to reproductive health, issues of unpaid care work, unpaid care obligations, mobility, as well as obviously education and skills and resources. And so trying to build this more nuanced, complicated case for women's economic empowerment was something that I felt was critical. And I have been doing that for actually the past sort of 4 or 5 years. I ultimately left my law firm and actually spent a year at Harvard in the Advanced Leadership Initiative, really trying to figure out for myself how to get companies to think about both economic empowerment this way and about local partners as much as these powerful partners. And how they ultimately, we could change the conversation, as we've seen over the past 30 years of, say, with how companies think about environmental sustainability, to make working with women in these really impactful, deeper ways, so they really were, as 50% of the population, were 50% at all layers in companies, in leadership roles, at all levels, though truly sort of empowered in a real sense. How to make that message be a message that was a long-term sustainability message for companies as well, making both the business case and the social impact case and linking those. I don't know, I don't know what you want. I mean, obviously the S.J.Ds are very powerful in linking to that. I don't know, Rangita, what you want me to, if there's anything else you want me to say. I feel like this panel has a lot of different things to say, but I think that bringing that conversation is very important. I would say that we sometimes play games in some of the workshops we do about what is your superpower. And I used to say my superpower was connecting, but now I say my superpower is naivete. Because I think that what makes us do things is not realizing how hard they are when you start, but feeling very passionate that they need to be done. And so I feel very blessed to be very naive. I think there's a lot of traction on these issues with corporate champions and with women's rights organizations on the ground who do, as Radhika said last night, also want to break out of silos, as the companies sort of want to break out of the silos and do things differently and understand the complexity. But to actually move that agenda forward is not easy.
So I kept Madam President to the last, because as you know, there's a collective yearning among all of us for Madam Presidents, right? And so when we have a Madam President, we are going to embrace her and keep her close to our heart. And we are not going to let you go, because the world needs Madam Presidents. And we bemoan the absence of Madam Presidents. So here we have Madam President. And Madam President, your work on leadership started at a very, very early age.
I hope this is the short version.
This is the short version. This is the very short version because there's more to come. Your story is going to be shared with us later tonight. But what I wanted to highlight was that those strands of leadership that you imbibed and you polished as President of Ireland, you brought to your leadership of the human rights movement, the human rights discourse. As the President of Ireland, you were the first to visit Rwanda. You visited Rwanda when you were President of Ireland. And little did you know at that time that it foreshadowed your work in the African region, around the world, in trouble spots as the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And then later, when you were appointed as the Special Envoy for the Secretary General to the Great Lakes. And there, once again, you brought women together as in that collective sense to build a movement, to build peace. But then your work took you to climate change and climate justice, and you created a whole new discourse, which now you've aptly called a feminist solution to a man-made problem. And that is really what climate justice is about, a feminist solution to a man-made problem. And you've kind of reinvented yourself in that process. You see yourself now in this kind of more modernist leader, where you've now embraced podcasts as a way of sharing stories of women who are in the front lines, at the grassroots level, working on climate justice, because you see that needs that kind of, that the top and the bottom must coalesce, and litigators, human rights lawyers must work with the grassroots activists. And in that sense, you've started what now you've again called Mothers of Invention, because you're really bringing mothers of invention together from all over the world, from the global south, the global north, but across these divisions, and building these movements that are cohesive, breaking down silos. So can you take us to this moment of your life where you've created Mother of Invention or Mothers of Invention and created these very funny podcasts where you have interaction with women from around the world, but how that was shaped by your work as Special Envoy to the Great Lakes, and even before that as a High Commissioner for Human Rights, and even before that, predating that, as the President of Ireland.
Well, I won't go back that far. I am the veteran on this panel. I think you're probably aware of that. And I'm very happy to be back in Harvard, because it's wonderful to catch up with 5 of the members of the panel that I know, and I've already exchanged cards with Marisa, because I think we could
talk some more.
Talk some more. But I think what I'd like to do is look at some of the difficult problems of actually getting a gender approach. And then I'll come to the podcast as a story at the end. But in fact, I'll be all stories, just to be shorter. When I became High Commissioner for Human Rights in 1997, I was following the first High Commissioner, Jose Ayala Lasso. He actually resigned quite suddenly, I think less than halfway through his term, to go back and become Foreign Minister of Ecuador, because he discovered, as Nave and myself discovered, that it's a very difficult job. And the first thing that amazed me, because I hadn't worked in the UN system before, was the fact that there were no women at senior levels. We had no gender policy whatsoever. And I wasn't really very accomplished in introducing a gender policy. I actually didn't know how to do it. And it was extremely difficult. And the one thing I realized when we pointed at a gender specialist, etc., is that unless, as High Commissioner, I kept my eye on what was happening, you have to do it from the top or it doesn't happen. And it actually was difficult. So that was my first experience. Interestingly, when I was appointed the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for the Great Lakes and the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2013, I was told that I was the most senior woman mediator. There hadn't been a woman mediator at that level before in the UN, which again, you know, well, it wasn't before time. But I decided, well, this gives me an opportunity. I'm going to really make sure that I make a difference as a woman in this role. And again, it was so difficult. I had 13 countries in this. There was a framework for peace, security, and cooperation that was formulated in early 2013, and I was the special envoy referenced in that framework. I had 13 countries, all with 13 male presidents, and 4 organizations, the UN, the African Union, the Organization for the Great Lakes, and the Organization for the Southern African, SADC, for Southern African states. And almost all of the leadership was male. Eventually, in order to, I formed a kind of technical group under the heads of state, because heads of state don't actually do anything, as we know. They need advisors, they need people equipped to move things forward. So we had this kind of technical committee, and again, all of the presidents appointed men to represent them on this committee. So I got my good friend Binta Diop of Femme Africa Solidarité, and fortunately, just before I asked her and begged her to help me by becoming a member of this technical group, because she then had and has now an official mandate as the Special Envoy of the African Union Commission on Women, Peace and Security. So there was a good reason to have her there. And then I decided that it would be good to take the 4 key countries of my mandate, which were, of course, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi, and to try to form a women's platform with those 4 countries. And so I got a little bit of support. I got great support from the Global Fund for Women. I was with Musimbi Kanyora, a Kenyan who heads the Global Fund at the moment, at the climate conference in California. I've just come from there, and we were talking about this women's platform, which is still going ahead. But the funny thing that happened was, there's a great suspicion of governments for any UN person. So if you're a UN envoy somewhere, they watch you very carefully. And I was doing something that hadn't been done before. I was creating a women's platform involving 4 countries. And the women, the ministers of gender, and in fairness, each of these countries had a minister for gender. Sometimes gender plus something else or whatever. It could be gender and sport or gender. But anyway, the 4 of them came to a meeting that I convened. And I saw them kind of in a corner having a very earnest conversation. And I knew that only 2 of them knew each other before, but all 4 were huddled. They were huddled in suspicion of me. And I realized that I had inadvertently brought them together. It was a great success. They really started to kind of, and they then decided that they would support the platform, but they would do it on their terms, which was perfect because it's their countries, etc. Anyway, that was another experience. And then I came into the climate world. And I came quite late to the climate world because as a High Commissioner, and I've often admitted this, I didn't see the connection between climate change and human rights. It was later when I was doing work in African countries that I learned. So my first COP, my first conference was Copenhagen. And I was active on climate justice for a couple of years before Copenhagen. And I realized that it was a very male world, not a very human rights world, and certainly not a gender-sensitive world. And eventually, the conference after Copenhagen, which by and large was regarded as having more or less failed, although there was the Copenhagen Accords, but it wasn't a great moment, there was a conference in Cancun in Mexico, and we realized that despite the fact that it was a very male world, 3 women were presiding over, being Madam President over 3 COPs in a row. In Copenhagen, it was Connie Hedegaard. In Mexico, in Cancun, it was Patricia Espinosa, who's now, in fact, executive head of the UN Climate Convention, UNFCCC. And that the following year in Durban, Navi's home base, it would be Mighty Mashaban. I know she has another name as well, but I'll call her Mighty Mashaban. And so we convened those 3 women, and my Foundation on Climate Justice offered to be the secretariat, and we called it the Troika Plus of Women Leaders on Gender and Climate Change. And we met in Durban at the next conference, and by then we had 40 members who were either ministers of environment or energy or even gender or foreign affairs. There was a mix who was there at the conference. We had heads of agencies like from Zille and UN Women, Helen Clark at the time of UNDP, and we had some supportive men. We didn't exclude men, we just kept them in their place, in a minority. And we plotted to take a weak decision about women's participation in delegations and on committees, etc., that was going to be 10 years old the following year in Doha. And we worked together with Christiana Figueres, with UN Women. They worked very hard as the Troika. We plotted, and members of the Troika took various geographical regions to work and make sure we got the political support. And we arrived in Doha with a much stronger amended draft decision, and a draft text for decision. And I got an urgent message, could I come to Christiana Figueres' office? Because there was a problem. And I said, well, what's the problem? She said, well, you've asked the European Union to put this through for the Troika of women leaders, and that was true. Finland has always been very strong on gender, and Finland took it to the EU, and the EU said, yes, we'll put this forward under any other business on behalf of the women, the Troika of women leaders. But the EU is full of lawyers, and some smart lawyer looked at the rules in detail and found that if you propose something at a conference, then it was almost impossible for it to be adopted. And that was what Christiana Figueres said to me. Mary, I'm afraid it's almost impossible. And I said to her, I'm glad I said it to her, Christiana, define almost. And she said, well, if the president of the conference sees that there is broad political support, then he could, he has the power to refer it for actual negotiation and decision-making. So when this was moved in the big floor with several thousand people in the room under any other business, there was an extraordinary moment where women were mobilized. And it began with something like, I think Grenada was the first in, Mexico came in, the United States came in, Japan came in, the European Union, of course, and went around. And the South African ambassador for climate change, as she was then, who's become a friend, Ambassador Diseko, who's now in Geneva, she held back cleverly and waited for this. And it was very moving, actually. I was always moved to tears just to hear different countries say, we want this decision to be negotiated, we want this draft to be negotiated, etc. And eventually, when she knew that she was going to be the last, Ambassador Diseko got up. She's not very tall, but she's got a great presence. And she said, Mr. President, because of course it was a man at this stage, and he had a moustache. And she said, Mr. President, as you know, the climate conferences have been presided over by 3 women. And now you have the opportunity to do what none of us could do, none of the 3 women. You can advance women's participation by allowing this to go forward for decision. And it was like theatre, I swear. What he said was, what can I do, a mere man? And he looked down and he saw written what Christiana had read. I see that there is broad support for this discussion. I now refer it for deliberation and negotiation. And afterwards, Christiana called it the Doha miracle. And this Troika of women leaders went on to do something that I felt was even more important in the context of conferences. We decided that these ministers who have access to the table and who in fact lead the negotiations would include grassroots and indigenous women in their delegations. And that has been happening. And it means that we now have wonderful voices of grassroots. I met a number of my friends in California at this conference, and they now know how to speak up and how to make their voice heard. And they say very decidedly, nothing without us, nothing about us without us, etc. And that to me makes a huge difference, that we're hearing the frontline experience. There is no substitute for that. And this is what I put in the book. Can I boast about? I've just given I've just given Rangita my only copy left, because I've come from a climate conference of this book which Bloomsbury's just published. Hope, Resilience and the Fight for a Sustainable Future, a book on climate justice. And
it captures the voices of some of the stories that you've been
literally,
shared.
and two of the stories, Constance O'Kellet, the first story in the book, and Hindu from Chad, were with me and on panels with me at the climate conference in California. So that was nice. And I just wanted to finish with a completely irrelevant story, but it speaks to what Susan was talking about in South Sudan. I'm honoured to be one of the elders that Nelson Mandela brought together, and we had a wonderful chair at the time and a wonderful chair who just died, Kofi Annan, but before him Archbishop Tutu was our chair, and we went to South Sudan. I think it was Archbishop Tutu, Marty Ahtisaari and myself. Marty Ahtisaari, former president of Finland, and it was the first anniversary of South Sudan as the new state. And there was a big religious ceremony the night before the official celebration of the first anniversary. You're nodding, you remember that, Susan? I do. Yes. And Archbishop Tutu was invited by the bishops and others. It was quite an inter-church and Muslim also. It was good. He was invited to speak. And he took his opportunity. And he said, I'm hearing about problems here at the moment with this new country, a new government. I hear the word corruption. Don't say corruption, say stealing from the people. And there was a huge roar from further back, and I was sitting as near as this to President Kiir and all his government ministers, and it was an extraordinary moment. But just when somebody speaks it like that, don't call it corruption, call it stealing from the people. I'll never forget it. And then the bishop who had invited Archbishop Tutu to speak, sort of said, well, I thank Archbishop Tutu for saying what only Archbishop Tutu could say. And anyway, that's it.
But all of you have spent your time speaking truth to power. So I think it is something that defines all of you. And just on Monday, I think because of your influence at the climate change conference in California, Secretary General Guterres warned us of the risks of climate change and said climate change is the defining issue of our time, and we are at this defining moment. Despite this grave and dire warning, as we know, our own president, President Donald Trump, has pulled us out of the 2015 Paris Agreement. So your work is so imminently urgent. And one of the reasons why it is so urgent and pressing is because you very movingly said, Madam President, that when I see my grandchildren, I know that this fight must continue. This is for my grandchildren and for yours. So this is really something that you're doing for us, for all of us, but for the future generations and for the future of this world.
Which is why it has to become much more of a women's leadership issue. It isn't enough. I don't understand why. It is for women leaders in Africa. It's high on the agenda, top of the agenda. It is for women in Asia, top of the agenda. But in this part of the world, we talk about Me Too, harassment, equal pay, all these issues, and then come to health, education, and then somewhere down the list is climate change.
Because you've always said women are the guardians
but also,
of the earth.
We're not on course for a safe world for our children and grandchildren. If that doesn't motivate women, I don't know what. I mean, men and women, but in particular women, because of the kind of nurturing qualities that that we instinctively have. Anyway, I didn't mean to get cross.
No, but on that note of nurturing the next generation, I think it is important for me to acknowledge all of your contributions to my generation, but most of all, the next generation of Harvard women leaders stand on your shoulders. And you're the foremothers of their of this new intellectual movement that sees the ways in which history and the ways in which all of you have worked on the UDHR. The UDHR principles are living principles, and that's what's so important, that this is not something that is frozen in time, but that are living, dynamic, constantly evolving principles, and that the next generation of leaders must embrace them as their own. So with